Hello and welcome to this new series on Indian polity. This is a quick revision series and we'll be starting off with the making of the Indian Constitution. The content will be presented in a flashcard format, so feel free to pause and play the video as and when you want to recall answers to a particular question and so on. Moving on to the first question. Who was the first person to demand a separate Constituent Assembly for India and in which year? Manavendra Nath Roy was the first person to demand a separate Constituent Assembly for India in the year 1934. He also founded the Communist Party of India in 1920. He developed a philosophy known as radical humanism. The Constituent Assembly was provided for under which proposal? Constituent Assembly was provided for under Cripps proposal. Which political party in India rejected the Cripps proposal? Muslim League rejected the Cripps proposal. When did the Cabinet Mission Plan arrive in India? The Cabinet Mission Plan arrived in India in March of 1946. The chief proposals of the Cabinet Mission Plan were to form a Union of India consisting of British provinces and Indian states, to establish a Constituent Assembly having 389 members, and to establish an interim government with 14 representatives of all major political parties. Who are the members of the Cabinet Mission Plan? Members of the Cabinet Mission Plan were Pethick Lawrence, who also was the chairman, A.V. Alexander, and Stafford Cripps. When was the Constituent Assembly established? The Constituent Assembly was established in May of 1946. When were the elections to the Constituent Assembly held? The elections to the Constituent Assembly were held in July and August of 1946. What was the total strength of the Constituent Assembly? The total strength of the Constituent Assembly was 389 members before partition, that is, an undivided India. How were the different members of the Constituent Assembly elected? 292 members were indirectly elected by the system of proportional representation by means of a single transferable vote by the elected members of the provincial assemblies. 93 members were nominated by the heads of the princely states, while 4 members were chosen from British Chief Commissioner areas. Which was the only political party in India that did not participate in the elections to the Constituent Assembly? The Communist Party of India was the only party which did not participate in the elections to the Constituent Assembly. How many seats did the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League win in the elections to the Constituent Assembly? The Indian National Congress won 208 seats, while the Muslim League won 73 seats. How many seats were left with the Indian Constituent Assembly after partition? 299 seats were left with the Indian Constituent Assembly after partition. When was the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly held? How many members were present on that day? The first meeting of the Constituent Assembly was held on 9th December 1946. It's important to note that 211 members were present on the first day. Who was elected as the provisional president of the Constituent Assembly on the first day of meeting? Dr. Sachidananda Sinha was elected as provisional president. Who were elected as the president and the vice president of the Constituent Assembly on 11th December 1946? Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the President of the Constituent Assembly, while H.C. Mukherjee was elected as the Vice President of the Constituent Assembly. Who replaced H.C. Mukherjee as the Vice President of the Constituent Assembly? V.T. Krishnamachari replaced H.C. Mukherjee as Vice President of the Constituent Assembly. So here you can remember the name which starts with the initial V. We will be also looking at another Krishnamachari in the same chapter, so it's important not to confuse between the two. So whenever the question is regarding to the Vice President, remember that it starts with a V and it's V.T. Krishnamachari. Who proposed the Objectives Resolution? What was it and when was it finally passed? Jawaharlal Nehru proposed the Objectives Resolution on 13 December 1946. It was the basis of the philosophical foundation to the Constitution, which later came to be known as Preamble to the Indian Constitution. This resolution was unanimously passed on 22nd January 1947. Who was the chief advisor to the Constituent Assembly? Benegal Narsingh Rao was the chief advisor, and it is important to note that he was a nominated member. He was an eminent jurist. He was the first Indian to become a member of the International Court of Justice. He was also a member of the drafting committee of the Constitution of Burma. Another important point about Benegal Narsingh Rao was that he was also a member of the Indian Civil Services. How many different types of committees were there in the Constituent Assembly? There were 22 major committees, 15 minor committees, and 7 subcommittees. We'll look at a few important ones later on in this chapter. Who are the members of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly? B.R. Ambedkar, who was also the chairman of the committee, Gopalaswamy Iyengar, Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, K.M. Munshi, Syed Mohammad Sadullah, N. Madhav Rao, who replaced B.L. Mitter, and T.T. Krishnamachari, who replaced D.P. Kaitan. The drafting committee was constituted on which date? 29th August 1947. How many drafts of the Indian Constitution were prepared in total, and which one was adopted? 2 drafts of the Indian Constitution were prepared and the second draft was adopted. On which date was the Indian Constitution adopted and enacted on? The Indian Constitution was adopted and enacted on the 26th of November 1949. On which date did the Indian Constitution come into force on? What was the significance of that date? The Indian Constitution came into force on 26 January 1950. This date was specifically chosen because in the past, the Indian National Congress in the Lahore session of 1929 had passed the Purna Swaraj Declaration, where it was declared that 26 January 1930 would be declared as Purna Swaraj Day. How many members attended the last unofficial session of the Constituent Assembly? 284 members attended the last session, and they also signed on the Constitution. Which body elected the first President of India? Constituent Assembly acted as the provisional body which elected the first President of India. Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the first President of India on 24th January 1950. After which event did most members of the princely states and those from the Muslim League who were absent till then take part in the Constituent Assembly? After the acceptance of Mountbatten Plan of 3rd June 1947 for the partition of the country. What changes were brought about in the position of the Constituent Assembly by the Indian Independence Act of 1947? The Constituent Assembly was made a fully sovereign body which could draft any constitution or law that it wanted and make amendments or changes to any of the existing laws made by the British Parliament for India. It also became a legislative body which made laws for the country. The Muslim League members hailing from the areas included in Pakistan withdrew from the Indian Constituent Assembly. Who was the first Speaker of the Constituent Assembly? G.V. Mavlankar was the first Speaker of the Indian Constituent Assembly. When did the Constituent Assembly first meet as a legislative body? The Constituent Assembly first met as a legislative body in November of 1947. How many days did it take the Constituent Assembly to draft the Indian Constitution? It took the Constituent Assembly 2 years, 11 months and 18 days to draft the Indian Constitution. Some important dates with reference to the Constituent Assembly. The first session of the Constituent Assembly was held between 9th and 23rd December of 1946. The last session was held between 14th and 26th November of 1950, while the total number of sessions were 11 and the total number of working days were 165. What was the total expenditure incurred in the making of the Indian Constitution? The total expenditure incurred by the Constituent Assembly in making the Indian Constitution was approximately 64 lakh rupees. Some important stats on members of the Constituent Assembly. The number of Dalit members were 33, number of women members were 15, and the number of nominated members were 15. Let's look at some of the important nominated members of the Constituent Assembly. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Benegal Narsingh Rao, H.V. Kamath, and K.T. Shah. So a simple hint to remember this group of people is 2BHK. We are using 2 here because Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan was the second president of the Indian Republic. Then B for Benegal Narsingh Rao, H.V. Kamath, and K.T. Shah respectively. How many source constitutions were referred to in the making of the Indian Constitution? 60 source constitutions were referred to in the making of the Indian Constitution. Important people associated with the Constituent Assembly. Chief Advisor was Benegal Narsingh Rao. Secretary of the Constituent Assembly was H.P. Iyengar. Calligrapher Prem Bihari Narayana Zada. Artist was Nandan Lal Bose. How many pages did the original copy of the Indian Constitution contain? 230 pages. What was the emblem of the Constituent Assembly? Initially, it was an elephant, subsequently changed to the lion capital of Sarnath. What was the composition of the Constitution when it was adopted in November of 1949? The Constitution contained 395 articles spread across 22 parts and had 8 schedules. Which articles came into force on 26 November 1949, the day the Constitution was adopted and enacted on? While this is a big list of articles, it's important to remember a few of them. That is, the articles which were related to citizenship, articles relating to the Election Commission. Who are the 2 prominent persons who did not take part in the Constituent Assembly? While we can name quite a few, it's very important to remember that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah were not a part of the Constituent Assembly. When did the Indian National Congress officially put forward the demand for a Constituent Assembly? The Indian National Congress officially put forward the demand for a Constituent Assembly in the year 1935. This was 1 year after Manavendra Nath Roy demanded a Constituent Assembly for India. On what basis and proportion were seats allotted to the provinces and princely states in the Constituent Assembly? Seats were allotted on the basis of population, and roughly one seat was allotted per 1 million of population. What other functions were performed by the Constituent Assembly apart from making of the Constitution and acting as a legislative body? The Constituent Assembly ratified India's membership in the Commonwealth. The national flag was adopted on 22nd July 1947. The national anthem and the national song were adopted on 24th January 1950. A simple way to remember this is we had to have a national flag when we were declared independent, so the national flag was adopted before independence, while the national anthem and national song came later on, just before the Republic Day. Let's look at a few of the important features of the Constituent Assembly. Allocation of seats based on population. Each province and princely state were allocated seats in proportion to their population. We saw that this number was roughly one seat per 1 million of population. Seats were allocated in each British province amongst three principal communities: Muslims, Sikhs, and the general population. Separate electorate. The representatives of each of the communities were to be elected by the members of that community only. Voting based on proportional representation by means of a single transferable vote. The representatives of the princely states were nominated by the heads of the princely states, and there was no universal adult franchise. Timeline of events leading up to the making of the Indian Constitution. In 1922, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi put forward the demand that India's political destiny should be determined by Indians. Motilal Nehru, in the Bombay session of the Indian National Congress, moved a resolution calling upon the Congress Working Committee to frame a constitution for India. In 1928, an all-party conference resolved to set up a committee under chairmanship of Motilal Nehru to determine the principles of a constitution for India. In 1928, the Nehru Report was put forward, which was the first attempt by Indians to set up a full-fledged constitution for India. In 1934, M.N. Roy put forward the idea of a Constituent Assembly for India. In 1935, the Indian National Congress officially demanded a Constituent Assembly. In 1938, Jawaharlal Nehru demanded that the Constitution must be framed by the Constituent Assembly, elected on the basis of a universal adult franchise system. In 1940, the demand for the Constituent Assembly was finally accepted by the British through the August Offer of 1940, and in 1942, the Cripps proposal on drafting the Indian Constitution was out, and in 1946, the Cabinet Mission Plan arrived in India, paving the way forward for the making of an Indian Constitution by an Indian Constituent Assembly. Some of the important committees headed by Jawaharlal Nehru: Union Powers Committee, Union Constitution Committee, and Committee on the Preamble. Some of the important committees headed by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel: Committee on Fundamental Rights and Minority Rights, Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities, Tribal and Excluded Areas. Important committees headed by Dr. Rajendra Prasad: Steering Committee and Rules of Procedure Committee. This brings us to the end of part 1 of this Indian Polity Quick Revision series. Do let us know your feedback and suggestions in the comments below. Thank you.